In this demo, we'll implement a simple talk application with XML web services. So basically we need a service on the server side that will allow clients to subscribe, and we'll have a service on the client side as well so that the server will notify the clients back. There are protocols like web services eventing for that, but we will just use a request response pattern with simple services, so we need a service on the client side as well. Let's just start by creating a new project in here, and I will have only one project that will handle also the client part. So I have Window Builder installed, and I'll just create a standard widget toolkit project, and I will just call my project talk. In here, I will have a package that's shared between the client and the server. So let's just go in here and create a new package. Let's call this common. And I'll need a package for the server side and one for the client side. So let's just create one for the server and another one for the client. So let's just go in here and create a new package for the client. We'll start by defining the contract of the services. So let's create an interface. I will call it iServer service. And I need a way, let me just adjust the font for you so you can see it better. So sorry for having to do that while recording. Nevertheless, I think 14 should be okay, or even 16. Anyway, I think 14 is fine. Okay, so with my service, I need a method to subscribe, and the client will just send an endpoint to the server where the client will listen to. Then I need another method to unsubscribe, and the client will unsubscribe with an endpoint. And the client should be able to send a message to the server, which should be a simple string. Now, this interface I'll use for SOAP services, a framework which is available with Java, and it's called Web Services Interoperability Framework, and it ships with JDK. So I have to annotate and say that this is a web service and this is a web method, and this is actually another web method, and by these annotations the framework will know how to generate the contract of the component. Now I only have to save this. Let's go and create another interface. This time the interface will define what the service on the client side should do. So let's call this iClient service. I only need one method by which the server will broadcast a message to the client. Let's just call this onReceive. So when a client application will send a message to the server by calling its send method, the server will notify by calling all the clients with this onReceive. I also have to specify this is a web service and that's the web method. Now let's just go and create on the server side an implementation for our service. Let's go and create a class. I will just call it a server service, and this has to implement the iServer service interface. Now, my class will have to provide the ability to subscribe. So let's just define here a list of strings, which will be our endpoints. Let's just create a new array list of strings for that. And let's just say those will be strings. Now, when we subscribe, we need first to check if the endpoints doesn't contain the endpoint that we need to subscribe, and because this is actually handled on the client side by several threads, I need to make sure that when I subscribe, this is a thread safe operation, so I just synchronize the access to the list of endpoints. Now, sorry, when I'm supposed to unsubscribe, I'll do in the same way the check if I do have this in my list, and then I just remove it from the list. When notifying all the clients. I will synchronize over the endpoints. I'll iterate with a simple endpoint that will be a string over my endpoints collection. And in the meantime, I'll just generate the loop variable. And I need to contact back and get a client proxy which will call the client endpoint. So let's just say that I have a service utils class, and this has a method called getClient, and I need to provide the endpoint and the interface that I like to call. So let's just generate the class for us because there is no one. So let's just generate the class, and I like to generate the class in the package called common. So the class has been generated. Now let's generate the method. That should be a static method, and my static method should be a generic one, should return an implementation of a type T, and should receive a contract, which is the interface I like to call over this endpoint. Now, let's say that we will implement this method for us, and when we obtain a proxy to call the service, we are able with this to do the remote call. Sorry, because this is contacting back the client, we should at least try to do the call. So I will surround this with try multi-catch. Actually, it's just catching a checked exception, and in case we have an exception, we just do nothing, but we continue notifying the rest of the clients. So I just need to close the sentence here. Now, the framework that we use enables us to get an implementation of the service on the fly, but we need to search for the service in the definition of the class. When we implement the service, we need to specify this is a web service, and we should say what is the interface that we expose. So from the common package, we expose iServer service. Now, we also need to give a name to the port that will publish, will describe this service. So let's just call this talk port. We also need to specify the name of the service. Let's call it talk service. And eventually we need to set the target namespace for the WSDL, for the file describing the contract of the service. And let's just use an URL for that, like, you know what, like xray.com/services/talk. Of course, there is no information available at this URL about the talk service, but nevertheless, we have to give it the target namespace, so that when we actually try to create an implementation for the contract, like a proxy that we can use to call the service from the client side, we need this to search for the definition of the service. So let's just define a service variable here, and we do have a class called service that's able to create a service based on an URL and a qualified name for the service. So let's just create an URL and call it URL, and we should create an URL with the endpoint URL, and then we should have a name of the service. So we create a qualified name, and the qualified name would have to contain the namespace. So we search basically in the URL, in the definition of the service, we search for this service which has the name that we put here, like talk service. Now, basically how the framework is working, let me just generate this variable for us. So the service will download the contract of the the framework would download the contract of the service, and based on the name of the service and the interface that's implemented by the service, it's able to generate an invoker of that interface. But because this is the URL where the service will be published, we need to download the WSDL file, which is the contract of the service. It's an XML describing what the service does, we need to take it from an URL ending with the query string for the WSDL. Now that we have the service, we will use the parameters to search for the service and then define the variable. Now, this may throw malformed URL exception, so we throw this away. With the service, we then take the port, which is the interface of the type of the contract. And when we generate an invoker, an implementation for this contract, we should make sure that the contract is in the list of the contracts implemented by the service. Now, with this, we are able to contact back the client and consume its interface by calling the onReceive method. Let's go and publish our service on the server side by creating a new class, and I will call this a server console, and this one should contain, so this is the console, should have a main. Let me just define a configuration file for us, so I'll just create another file which will be the properties file called settings.properties, and this should say what is the server, what is the IP of the machine that we use to exchange messages with. So let me just take my IP for the Ethernet connection. So this is actually my IP at this moment. So let's just copy this. Then we need a default port on which we start the service. And I think we need somehow an URL, like for instance we publish on HTTP, and so let's just call this an URL, and the URL should look like HTTP, the name of the host, then the value for the port, and then we should use a name for the context of the service. So let's just create a configuration class that will read the properties. So let's just create a settings class, and in here we should have a static field that should be final of type resource bundle. Sorry for the spelling. So a resource bundle, let's just call this a bundle, and with the resource bundle class we then take the bundle and we use the settings class. We take the name of the class and we convert it to lower, because as you saw we are using only lowercase for the name of the file. Then let's just define a static field which will be a static method which will return the port from the settings, and we then return the integer parseInt, and we take with the bundle the string key called port. But before that we also need one for the server, so let's just have a public static method which will return the name of the server, like getServer, and we return the bundle getString of the name server. Now let's just continue and return the URL, so that's going to be a public static string method which will return the URL. So we then return the bundle getString by the name URL. Now that we have those methods implemented and this utility class created, let's go in our console, and in here we'd like to publish the service. So we would like to be able with the service, first of all, let's just create an implementation of the iServer service. Let's just call it a server service, and we create a new server service class. And then we'd like to use the service utils class to publish our service, and we need to create an endpoint. So this will be the endpoint where we publish the service. We then use the message format to format the default URL, and let me just take this URL with the settings get URL. Come on. And we format this URL, and we need to put the name of the host. So we take the inet address get the local host and then get the host address. That's going to be the IP. And the second parameter that we need to put is going to be the port. So let me just define here an integer called port, and we then call the settings get port. Come on, sorry for the spelling. Once again, get port. So we then put here the value of the port. With this URL, we need a method to publish on an endpoint, and with an implementation of the service, that's going to be our server service. The method doesn't exist, so let's just create this utility method for us. The method should be a generic one, should return void, but it has to get an implementation of the service, an instance of the service. So this is going to be actually an alias, because the framework already provides a way to publish on an endpoint an implementer, which in our case will be the service. So the address is going to be the endpoint. Now, with this method, we are able to publish this method exception, and eventually we should at least display the stack trace of the exceptions. So let's just go in here and surround this with a try multi-catch block. And in case of an exception, we do display this. You know what? Let's just check. Let's catch a checked exception. Now let's just output some text to the user, like the server is running, and you may type exit to stop it. Okay. And now let's just read commands with a scanner from the command line. So let's just create a scanner, and the scanner should be imported. Let's just define a variable scanner here. The scanner should be the one from JavaUtil, and we then create a new scanner, and the scanner should read from the system in console. Now all that we need to do here would be to read commands from the command line. So let's just define here a command argument, and with the scanner we take the next line, and if the console has been closed, so the command that we read is null, or the exit is equal, regardless the case with the command, then we just break the while true. So that's all that we do. We publish the service and we wait for the administrative commands. With this implementation, now the server is able to run. By the way, when we start the server, we should try to see what we did. When we start the server, we should see in the console that okay, so the URL, we do have an issue here. So you see that because of the way message format it's using the unit separator, this is it's an invalid port when we generate it. So instead of putting the port here, we just need to make it a string, like we call the integer to string, which will not generate this. Now let's just run this again. Sorry that I forgot about it. So let's just run this as a Java application, and it says that the server is listening. Now let's just try to open HTTP on my IP address, which was this one, I think, and the port should be 8080, and then the context should be talk, and we ask for the wisdom. So as you may see, we are defining a talk service which is exposing a talk port, and this is the address where the service is available. And the talk port that you can see here, this is the definition of the binding that corresponds to the talk port binding, has those methods: subscribe, unsubscribe, actually subscribe, send, and unsubscribe. So we do have a running service, we have a wisdom for that, and we should implement a client. Now let's just go in the client folder in the client package and implement the class. That's going to be our client service, and this should implement the iClient service interface. Now with my client, first of all, the client would have to let's just create a constructor for my client service. And this one should be also a web service that the server may call. So this we need to specify it's a web service. Now let's go to the server service and just copy what we put here. And we also need to annotate our service. And this time we implement the client interface, on the client interface, and we should use the same values for the rest. Now, when we contact the server, we need to know what is the address of the service that we will contact. Therefore, let me just put here an endpoint. Now, we also need to know what will be. You saw that when we publish the service in the console, sorry, we used some arguments to generate the endpoint. So let me just call this a server endpoint, and this should be a client endpoint. Actually, we only need to know what we have only one endpoint of the server, and this should be the port on which we try to publish the client, and we'll use the same value for the pattern of the endpoint. Now, because this will be a service invoked by the servers on the client side, this will actually not be the interface itself, the UI. So I will need an additional implementation of the client service, which will eventually be the one that will receive the message. So when we will get the message, we need to have a client on our class. Let's just define this client, and this will be the one that will receive the invocation to display the message. Now, let me just create a server service, and let me just rename this because this is not actually the one that I expect to be. So let me just rename this client to be client service. No, it's just a client, sorry. Just 1 second. Let me just generate an implementation for calling the service on this endpoint. So we take the service utils and we get the client on this endpoint, and this should consume the iServer client iServer service, sorry, interface. So actually we need a way to contact and consume the remote service on the server side. We need to store a reference to what is the actual client that should be notified when receiving a message. And we also need to create a service on the client side. So let's just define here a client service. And in order to publish this, I will use my service utils to publish, but this time I will provide as argument an endpoint, and the implementation should be my server. So let's just create a server service, a client service for that. I will say that the client service, it's actually this, sorry. So let me explain what I'm trying to do here, because obviously it's not that clear. I receive an endpoint of the server service that I need to work with. I will then take as argument the port on which I should publish my local service that the server service would call. And then I need an implementer which will be the UI that will be notified when receiving a message. So I create a proxy to call the remote service. I then need to create a service endpoint. So let's just call this an endpoint. And this should be where I publish my client service. So this is actually the implementer. I don't have this method created. I need to generate it. Should be also a generic method which will return this time a string, and it will receive an implementer that will be the service, and it will try to publish this on a given port. So basically it goes like this. And I can even take one more parameter that would be the template for the URL on which I like to publish. So let's just add here an URL as parameter, and when I try to publish this, I will use a template and a port. So let's just adjust the method once again to receive also the URL as argument. Now let's just generate this local endpoint as a field in the class that will be a string. So basically what we are trying to do, we may start the server and clients on the same machine. So the server will be able to bind and listen to that port, but the clients will use the same port and they will try to bind to that context as well. If they are not able to do that, then they will increase the port and take the first available port on which they can listen. So let me just go in here, and what we try to do would be, first of all, if the port is less than the short max value, remember that I would have to tell you that the integers are on 4 bytes, so they are the value is bigger. The max value for the integer is bigger than the one for the port, which is using 2 bytes like short. But short still is signed, so it's half of the values, but nevertheless. So what I'll try to do, I need to generate the endpoint. I'll use the message format, and then I'll try to format this pattern, which is the URL, and I also need to include the host and the port. So I took the inet address, I get the local host, I get the host address, and then the port. Now, as you saw, this may throw an exception. Let's just throw it away. But you saw that we need to do an integer to string in order to get the appropriate format for the value of the integer. Or you know what? It's a short. No, it's an integer. So integer. Sorry. Okay. So we try to bind to this. So we have a publish method which is able to publish on this endpoint with this service. We then need to do a try and catch in here. So I will then surround this with a try catch block. And in case we have an exception, the only thing that we need to do is to increase the port and try the next available port. But still, if we manage to publish this, then we return the endpoint as being the one on which we managed to publish. So this will eventually return to the client, and this may throw an unknown host exception. This will return where the client has been registered, has been published. Now that we have this URL, we then take the server service and we try to subscribe with this endpoint. Now we need a method that we close the connection, and we'll just call the method unsubscribe. And when we unsubscribe, we will then take the server service and we unsubscribe with the endpoint. Now we also need a method to be able to send a message to the server, and we will have only one argument that will be the message. So we take the server service and we then send this message. With this client, we are able to publish our own local service and then subscribe to the remote service with the URL that the server can call back. Now let's just design an UI and have an implementation for that. So let's just go in here and create this time I will use standard widget toolkit, and I will create a shell from the window builder templates, which is actually like a form. I'll just call this a client shell, and this should be the UI. Now let's just go in the design mode, and with the design mode, let's maximize this. I have the form, the shell, and I will just give this a text like talk, and this should have a layout, and we should align the controls inside with a grid layout. Now I need to have a list of messages, so I'm taking a list and doing a click in here. This will have to take the horizontal space and fill it, and in the end I will also fill the vertical space, but let me just put a text box here, and this should fill the horizontal space and also grab the horizontal space. This should grab the vertical space while filling it. Now that I have all these, let's go and implement the logics. So let's go in here, and in the create contents method I need, for instance, with the text to set focus, so the user will be able just to enter the values in here. As you may see in the constructor, it's creating the list, but it's not defining a field for that. But I still need to have a field to access this from different methods. Now, after creating the contents, I will then create in my class a field which will be called my client service, and I will instantiate a new client service. I need to provide some data, like for instance the remote server endpoint. I don't have the server endpoint, but I do have the data to compute it. So let's just define here an endpoint, and for that, you know what, let me just define before that an URL, and we take the URL with the settings. We also need to know the port, and we just take the port from the settings. So the endpoint should be obtained by calling message format, and I also need to know what is the name of the server that I need to contact. So take the settings, get the server name. This would be the URL. Here I need to put the IP of the server, and I also need to put the value of the port. So I do a toString with the port, and then I compute the endpoint of the remote server. I do have the port, I do have the URL, but I don't have the client. The client that should handle the callback, it's actually my shell. So I will let my shell implement iClient service, and I will add the unimplemented methods. Actually, when I receive a notification, I like to add this to the list. But because the notification will be received by a background thread, and this is not the thread of the UI, I will have to take the thread of the UI. So I'll take the display, I get the default, which is the UI thread, and I call to do an async job. So I interrupt the UI thread and ask it to update it. So I will receive an argument which should be my message. So with my message, I need to have a lambda expression. So my list can add the message as an item. This is actually an implementation of runnable, the way the task is defined. Now, I need to define this in my class, and I have it. And this may throw an exception that I will just throw outside. Several exceptions, actually, there are two. Now, with this client service, and after creating this client service, this will also subscribe. Now, I have to make sure that when the form will be closed, so I go here, I select my shell, and I have some methods, some events here. So the one which is inherited from the shell, it's closed. When this will be closed, I will try with my client service, I will try to unsubscribe. This may throw an exception. No, it's not the case here. Now, I need to make sure that when I type something here and press enter, I send this to the server. So let's just go on the list of events here, define a handler, and the handler is for a key event, and when we release the key, we should try to do this. So we check if the code of the key that has been released is returned, it's enter. So we compare this with the constant which is carriage return. We then take the text out of the text box and we trim it and we check if the length is greater than 0. If so, we then define a string for the message. So let's just have a string here for the message that we like to send. We take the text without the spaces in the beginning and in the end, and then we use the client service, and we call the method send with this argument. And then we have to also to clear the text. So the text we set the text of our text to be an empty string. Okay, so this is all that we need to do in order to implement the task. So here we call the message to send, and now let's just test what we did. So organize the imports first in my shell. I think there was something missing, something which was not necessary. And once again, let's just go in here, and this is our service. We need to start the console of the server. So let's just go in here, and we run this as Java application. So we started the server. Now let's just create start one client. So we run this as a Java application, and the client is trying to register with the server, and it managed to register with the server. Now let's just create the second client. So I go in here and I will just run this as a Java application, and this will register with the server again. So if I type something like "did you enjoy it" and I press enter, you see that the message has been received by this application as well. So if I say something like "no," then you see I will receive this. Okay, so thanks for watching. That was all.